Hello, students. So this chapter, we're talking about chapter 2. So chapter 2 is the beginnings of English America. So of course they devote a whole entire chapter to the movement of folks from England to the New World. So with the English, so the English colonization occurred between 1607 and 1660. It was slow moving, but it moved throughout the northeastern regions of the United States. So England transformed to a latecomer, but of course a dominant imperial power during this time frame. So even though their counterparts in Spain and Portugal were already in the New World, England was kind of late to the game. So they arrived a little bit later. Most of the motivations for the movement of the English to the New World were religious tensions, economic distress, and of course national rivalry that was occurring. With the Protestant Reformation that was occurring in Europe at this point in time and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 emboldened England to spread Protestantism throughout the world and of course challenge their counterpart of Spain, because Spain at this point in time was Catholic. A lot of English were also in need of land because land at this point in time was scarce due to overpopulation. They were also faced with unemployment and population growth, as I mentioned. So basically pushed a lot of the English to new opportunities, trying to seek elsewhere. So colonization provided that to them. One of the first colonies that started by the English in the New World was, of course, Jamestown. Jamestown was a joint stock venture by the Virginia Company, and it occurred in 1607. It was a commercial effort. It wasn't religious at this point in time, unlike later colonies that were started by the English. But the early years in Jamestown were disastrous to the English that were settling there. They were faced with starvation, disease, and of course, constant conflict with the Native Americans that were around there. So basically almost doomed the whole entire colony from the beginning. So they also dealt with starvation, specifically during the winters of 1609 to 1610, which also killed most of the population of settlers in Jamestown. Under the leadership of John Smith, John Smith arrived with numerous supplies, and crucially, he was also able to learn how to target a cash crop in that region, which was known as tobacco. So John Rolfe was responsible for the cultivation of tobacco, and then John Smith knew that that was the cash crop that they needed. So they can easily then bring that back home, right, to England. So they have easy access to tobacco. So tobacco became Virginia's gold. That was their most wealthy crop that they could bring. So it anchored the economy, and it also was able to help bring that wealth back to England at that point in time. They had a lot of labor demands in order to make sure that they had enough hands to help with regards to cultivation of tobacco. So the colony actually adopted indentured servitude. So with this, it's a little bit like slavery that you may have read if you ever took Western Civ or other classes in history. So with indentured servitude, they brought thousands of poor English workers who agreed to work for a period of time, in this case, usually about 5 to 7 years, and then they would then get their exchange for their passage to the New World. After their servitude or their time was up, so say for example of 7 years, then they were considered free, and then they could get their own land, farm, whatever else they needed to do. So this was an easier aspect at this point in time for them to have their own people help out with the cultivation of tobacco. Later on, this system will get used and turn away toward more African slavery, which we'll talk about specifically as the chapters go on. But in the beginning, they relied on their own people to help with that. Okay, so let's talk about the relationship that the English had with the Native Americans at this point in time. So the English encountered Chief Powhatan. So initially, they had trade and tense diplomacy. Eventually, it turned to conflict, and they did have a kind of wars that ended up happening. So they were called the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. So it kind of caused a lot of devastation for both, but especially for the Native American population. Unlike the Spanish, who incorporated native labor, the English largely sought land for themselves, which escalated tensions with the native groups. So there wasn't a lot of intermixing between the natives and the English at this point in time, but the English were land hungry at this point in time. So they're going to want to take whatever they can in order to expand and also ensure that they have enough land for their people. Okay, So a lot of the English settled in the Chesapeake region. So as we talked about with Jamestown, so that was in Virginia. They also had the Maryland colony, which was in 1632. It was founded by the Catholic Calvert family. They also developed plantations and cash crops, also relied on tobacco and unfree labor. So your indentured servitude, as we did before. Maryland was also a unique type of colony. Their initial attempt was at religious tolerance, so meaning accepting of all religions, regardless of whether you're Catholic or Protestant or others. But in 1649, there was the Act Concerning Religion, which offered some protections for Christians of various denominations, but not for a lot of non-Christians or dissenting Protestants at that point in time. So, of course, there was a lot of religious animosity that was occurring between the different religious groups and religious English groups in Virginia and also secondarily in Maryland as well, because you have the conflict between, once again, just like in Europe, the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. Okay, so another group that did settle as well, but to the north, so in New England, where we are. So the New England colonies were founded by the Puritans. So the Puritans were fleeing England due to religious persecution. So the Pilgrims around the year 1620, and later on the Massachusetts Bay Puritans in 1630, they were the ones that created a tightly knit, unified community, unified colony for themselves. John Winthrop was the governor of Massachusetts at that point in time, and he envisioned this whole entire model of a community, a city upon a hill that provided them with religious freedom that they needed. And it also modeled a Christian society with moral discipline, communal values, and the like. And the Puritan covenant stressed conformity, but also strived on education, because that was very important to them, and also being able to have local governance. So just definitely keep that in mind as the chapters go on, because eventually this will kind of turn when we start talking about the American Revolution. So these colonies want some sort of government and they're going to want to keep it local, right? So it's going to be totally different than having, King George in England and what he's trying to instill as well. Okay. There were religious dissenters, of course, in the New England colonies. So religious dissent was not tolerated. These are people who strayed from religious belief. They were not the norm. So they were not true Protestant. They were not true Puritans. They were different. So folks like Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams is probably the most important. So he's the one that founded Rhode Island. So Rhode Island is its own state. I always known it as the dissenting colony. So anyone that didn't stick with the religious beliefs was kind of kicked out and moved to Rhode Island at this point in time. Anne Hutchinson, same thing. She was banished because she challenged church authority. So they were different. They didn't want to do the same thing as the other religious groups in the civilization at that point in time had. So it's a stray. Other things as well. So we're talking about government because I think government's kind of important for these colonies. So many of these colonies had what's called a representative government. So in Virginia in 1619, they set up what's known as the House of Burgesses, which is the first elected assembly in North America for the English. So it's definitely different than having a king back in England. So they're trying to set up some sort of republic, democracy, some sort of autonomy that they needed. So despite the differences between all the different colonies and where they settled and who they were faced with regards to their Native American counterparts, they believed in a lot of different things that were very similar. So they believed in English superiority at this point in time. They wanted religious freedom, which I think is important. They depended on their unfree labor, so their indentured servitude. They also wanted to expand their lands, right? They wanted to expand the English footprint throughout North America at this point in time. So just take that as a takeaway as you read through the chapters, because I think it's very important to focus on why they ended up moving to the New World, what was their motivators, the differences between the colonies and their leadership, and of course focusing on the contrast religiously. Okay, so thank you for watching this video for Chapter 2. Look forward to seeing you in Chapter 3.